In 2023, the Northern Elders Forum did something that mattered in Nigerian electoral arithmetic. It stayed quiet while the North's governors delivered votes that helped put Bola Ahmed Tinubu in Aso Rock. Since that election, the same Northern Elders Forum has issued a formal demand for a security state of emergency across northern Nigeria. It has accused the Tinubu administration of unconstitutional appointment patterns that violate Section 14, subsection 3 of the 1999 Constitution. It has sent an open letter to the president protesting the location of a National Gold Refinery in Lagos, while northern states supply the gold, bear the environmental damage, and absorb the security cost. And it has formally opposed a request for a further 17.89 trillion naira in loans, citing a borrowing record it says has produced, in its own words, 0 implemented capital projects in the north in 2025. None of those demands have been met. While everyone is talking about whether the north still backs Tinubu heading into 2027, nobody is asking the more important question: what exactly did the Northern Elders Forum ask for, when did they ask for it, and what precisely and on the record has the Tinubu administration delivered against each of those requests? Because the answer to that question is not a political opinion, it is a documented paper trail, and that trail is what this video is about. Most channels will give you the headline, we give you the architecture behind it. If you have never been here before, you just found Nigeria's most analytical political channel. Subscribe, because what comes next in this video is the part they hope you never piece together. Who is the Northern Elders Forum, precisely? The Northern Elders Forum is not a government institution, a political party, or an electoral body. It is an advocacy group whose spokesperson, Professor Abubakar Jika Jidere, has been the public face of a sustained series of formal communiqués, open letters, and press statements directed at the Tinubu administration since 2023. It does not carry the institutional authority of the Sultan of Sokoto or the formal mandate of the 19 northern governors. What it carries is a documented record of formal grievance and the political credibility of having made each of those grievances publicly and repeatedly before they became mainstream headlines. It is also important to note the existence of a competing voice, the Concerned Northern Elders, a separate grouping that has publicly defended Tinubu's economic reforms and accused the NEF of representing political opposition rather than genuine northern advocacy. That split itself tells you something significant about the fracture lines within northern elite opinion ahead of 2027. The 4 grievances, source by source. Security, NEF communiqués, June and September 2025. The Northern Elders Forum formally demanded a state of emergency declared across northern Nigeria on 2 separate occasions in 2025. The June communiqué followed the killing of more than 20 soldiers in an ambush in Bangi, Mariga local government area, Niger State. The September communiqué followed the massacre of at least 27 worshippers at a mosque in Ungwan Mantau village and the execution of 35 abductees in Zamfara State despite ransom payments. The NEF characterized northern Nigeria as, in its own language, drowning in blood, its people abandoned, while security forces either cannot respond or are completely absent. No state of emergency has been declared. Appointments. NEF Statement, April 25, 2025. The Northern Elders Forum formally accused the Tinubu administration of concentrating federal appointments disproportionately in the Southwest, citing Chapter 2, Section 14(3) of the 1999 Constitution, which mandates that government composition reflect Nigeria's federal character. The NEF specifically condemned the composition of the National Census Committee as grossly and blatantly lopsided in favor of the Southwest. It demanded immediate reconstitution of the committee and a holistic audit of all MDA appointments. The Census Committee has not been reconstituted. Gold Refinery. NEF Open Letter, January 18, 2026. The Northern Elders Forum sent a formal open letter to President Tinubu and the Federal Executive Council, protesting the siting of the National Gold Refinery in Lagos. The letter argued that Zamfara, Kebbi, Niger, Kaduna, and Katsina, the gold-producing states, have borne the environmental and security costs of mining while being denied the industrial infrastructure and jobs created by refining. The NEF described the decision as, in its exact language, a deliberate act of economic dispossession. The federal government responded that the refinery is a private sector initiative and that government does not control its location. The NEF has not accepted that answer. Borrowings. NEF Statement, December 2025. The Northern Elders Forum formally opposed the government's request for a further 17.89 trillion naira loan to fund the 2026 budget. It cited a documented borrowing trajectory. 2.17 trillion naira borrowed in 2023, with approximately 70% of capital targets achieved. $21.5 billion and associated foreign currency borrowings in 2024, with approximately 30% of capital targets met. And escalating 2025 borrowings, including $2.347 billion, 4 billion euros, 1.15 trillion naira, and a $500 million sukuk bond, with the forum claiming, as of December 2025, that none of the linked capital projects had been implemented. Reported across This Day and All Africa from public records cited by the NEF. The NEF's 4 grievances span security, constitutional law, resource economics, and fiscal accountability. Together, they constitute not merely a policy complaint, but the architecture of a potential northern electoral withdrawal from Tinubu. We will return to whether each pillar of that architecture is structurally sound and whether the Tinubu administration has the political tools to respond to it before 2027. There is a question beneath all 4 of the NEF's demands that nobody in Nigerian mainstream media is asking directly. Is the Northern Elders Forum the genuine voice of Northern political sentiment, or is it a vehicle for opposition interests dressed in elder statesmanship? The answer to that question determines how seriously Asorok needs to take this paper trail. We will come back to it. Demand 1. Security. The state of emergency nobody declared. The security demand is the most emotionally weighted of the 4 and analytically the most straightforward. The NEF is not asking for something new, it is asking for a mechanism that exists in the Nigerian Constitution, Section 305, and that has been deployed before. A state of emergency concentrates federal resources and legal authority on a defined crisis zone for a defined period. The NEF's argument is that the scale and persistence of insecurity across the Northwest and Northeast has passed the threshold that justifies it. The Tinubu administration's response has been military operations and condolence statements. What it has not provided is the formal declaration that the NEF is asking for, which is being read in the North not as a security calculation but as a political one. The implicit message the absence sends is that Northern lives, while acknowledged, are not a sufficient national emergency to trigger the constitutional mechanism designed for exactly this situation. The NEF noted in September 2025 that it expected insecurity and banditry to be largely defeated by 2026. We are in 2026. The forecast has not been met. The formal demand has not been answered. Here is the number the Tinubu administration watches more carefully than any approval rating on the security file. The NEF warned in June 2025 that continued federal inaction would, in its own language, provoke open resistance. That is not the language of a civil society communiqué. That is a political ultimatum framed in institutional language. The significance of that framing is that it signals the NEF is prepared to escalate beyond formal statements if the security situation does not change. What that escalation looks like in practice in terms of electoral endorsements, opposition coordination, and public mobilization
is the variable Aso Rock is managing going into 2027. Demand 2. Appointments, the constitutional argument. The appointments grievance is the most legally precise of the four. Section 14, subsection 3 of the 1999 Constitution is not a guideline or a principle, it is a mandatory provision. The composition of the federal government and its agencies shall reflect Nigeria's federal character and prevent domination by any single group. The NEF's April 2025 statement invoked this provision directly, and the invocation matters because it transforms a patronage complaint into a constitutional one. You cannot dismiss a Section 14 subsection 3 argument as political sour grapes. You have to answer it with appointment data. The Tinubu administration has not published a formal response to the NEF's Section 14 subsection 3 argument. The National Census Committee has not been reconstituted, and the census itself, which will determine federal allocation shares and National Assembly seats distribution for the next decade, is proceeding under a committee whose composition the NEF has publicly characterized as illegitimate. A census whose results are rejected by the North before they are published is not a census, it is a political crisis with data output, and the NEF has already laid the groundwork for that rejection. The most underreported dimension of the appointments dispute is the census connection. Population figures from the next census will determine the arithmetic of Nigerian federalism for the following decade: federal allocation per state, House of Representatives seat distribution, the relative weight of each geopolitical zone in national political calculations. The NEF is not fighting over ministerial posts. It is fighting over the demographic foundations of northern political power. That is a structural argument about the architecture of Nigerian federalism, not a patronage complaint. And the Tinubu administration has treated it as the latter. Now, if what I just told you surprises you, drop a comment below. I want to know what you think before we get to the part that changes everything. Demand 3. Resource economics. The gold refinery argument. The gold refinery dispute is the sharpest and most recent flashpoint, and the language the NEF used in its January 2026 open letter marks a clear escalation in tone from all previous communications. The letter's own title, Open Letter to the Federal Government of Nigeria on the Location of the National Gold Refinery, Federal Character, Derivation, and the Deepening Crisis of Structural Inequality, tells you the NEF is no longer making a request. It is making a structural indictment. The core argument is a derivation logic applied to solid minerals rather than oil. The North's oil-producing counterparts have fought for decades over derivation, the principle that resource-producing regions deserve a share of the value generated from their resources. The NEF is extending that argument to gold. Zamfara, Kebbi, Niger, Kaduna, and Katsina produce the gold. Those states absorb the environmental degradation and the security cost of artisanal and industrial mining. The refinery, where gold becomes value-added product, where industrial jobs are created, where the economic multiplier lands, has been built in Lagos. The federal government's response that the refinery is a private sector initiative and government has zero equity in it is technically accurate, but it does not answer the policy question the NEF is raising. In what kind of governance framework does the enabling environment for a national gold refinery get created in the commercial capital rather than in any of the 5 states whose communities have paid the cost of producing the gold that refinery will process? Demand 4. The borrowing record. The borrowing demand is the most data-intensive of the 4 and the most difficult to verify independently because it relies on the NEF's own reading of capital project implementation. But the trajectory the forum documents, from 70% delivery in 2023 to 30% in 2024 to a claimed 0 in 2025, describes a pattern of declining fiscal accountability that is consistent with independent reporting on capital budget implementation across multiple Nigerian budget cycles. The political significance is not the precise percentage figures. It is that the NEF is on formal record opposing further borrowing on the grounds that previous borrowing has not reached the communities that need it most, and that it is making this argument publicly, in detail, in a pre-election year. That argument will not require refinement to become a campaign document for any opposition candidate willing to pick it up.
What Tinubu is actually doing about it. Strategy 1. The concerned Northern Elders counter-narrative. The most direct tool in the Tinubu political machine's response to the NEF is not a policy announcement. It is the concerned Northern Elders, a competing grouping that has publicly defended Tinubu's economic reforms, accused the NEF of being a vehicle for political grievance rather than Northern advocacy, and described the NEF's position on the FIRS and economic reform agenda as failing to reflect the collective conscience of Northern Elders. The existence and active promotion of this counter-voice is a deliberate strategy to fracture the perception of Northern elite consensus and deny the NEF the authority to speak for the region as a whole. Strategy 2. Targeted Northern investment announcements. Tinubu cannot reverse the economic pain of 2023 to 2025 before 2027. What his team can do is manage the optics, announcing infrastructure projects in contested northern states, deploying federal investment in states whose governors are politically persuadable, and timing those announcements to blunt specific NEF grievances in the new cycle. The goal is not to solve the security crisis or the appointment imbalance. The goal is to produce enough visible activity in enough specific places that the dominant narrative shifts from "the North has been abandoned" to "things are starting to turn around." Strategy 3. Northern governors management. The governors who will matter most to Tinubu's 2027 survival in the North are not the ones already committed to APC. They are the governors managing domestic political pressure from electorates who are angry at the economy and at the security situation, and who are calculating whether their political survival in 2027 is better served by loyalty to Tinubu's ticket or by visible distance from it. The Tinubu political machine is working the governors' conference not to manufacture enthusiasm, but to prevent defection, and to ensure that no northern governor becomes the first to publicly signal that the northern accommodation is over. The 2027 opposition variable. The NEF's grievances are not happening in a political vacuum. They are being watched by every potential 2027 opposition candidate as a ready-made northern mobilization frame. The question is whether any single opposition figure from PDP, Labour Party, or NNPP can credibly claim the NEF's documented grievances as their electoral platform, or whether the NEF's institutional positioning makes it unwilling to formally endorse any candidate. What the NDF has not yet done, and what would represent the most significant escalation of its campaign, is a formal electoral declaration, a 2027 Northern agenda that names what it will require from any presidential candidate seeking Northern support. That step has not been taken. Watch for whether it is. The deepest strategic problem in the Tinubu camp's response to the NEF is not any single grievance. It is the compound effect of 4 grievances that reinforce each other. The security demand establishes that Northern lives are not being protected. The appointments demand establishes that Northern participation in federal governance is being structurally reduced. The gold refinery dispute establishes that Northern resources are being processed for others' benefit, and the borrowing demand establishes that the national debt being accumulated is not building the infrastructure the North needs. Any one of those arguments is manageable in isolation. Together, they constitute a coherent narrative of Northern exclusion that no single policy announcement can rebut, and that is precisely why the NEF has chosen to make all 4 simultaneously.
What Northern grievance costs Nigeria? A governing coalition that is institutionally preoccupied with managing Northern elite discontent from the second year of its mandate is a coalition whose policy decisions are shaped by electoral calculation rather than national need. The decisions Nigeria most needs between now and 2027, sustained security sector reform in the Northwest and Northeast, constitutional compliance in federal appointment patterns, equitable resource infrastructure distribution, and genuine capital budget accountability are precisely the decisions most likely to be diluted or delayed if they conflict with short-term political positioning. The country most likely to emerge from a Tinubu second-term campaign is not a country whose Northern grievances have been addressed. It is a country whose Northern grievances have been managed to the election date. The deeper structural question. The deepest question the NEF's 4 demands raise is not about Tinubu personally. It is about whether Nigeria's federal structure, as it currently operates, is capable of producing the equitable resource distribution, constitutional appointment compliance, and security architecture that the North requires, regardless of who is president. The NEF's paper trail from 2023 to 2026 documents a consistent pattern formal demands made through institutional channels, temporary engagement from the administration, and persistent non-delivery. If that pattern continues into 2027, the political consequence is not just an electoral challenge for Tinubu, it is a degradation of the northern population's belief that formal institutional advocacy produces results, and that degradation, once established, does not reverse easily. The international dimension. Nigeria's international partners, the IMF, the World Bank, the United States and the United Kingdom have all publicly supported the structural reforms Tinubu implemented in 2023. That support has given his government macroeconomic credibility that has partially offset the domestic political damage of those reforms. But international partners do not vote in Nigerian elections, and the growing gap between Nigeria's macroeconomic narrative of reform and stabilization and the lived economic reality of northern households operating under 40% food inflation in a region simultaneously experiencing the worst security environment in a generation is a gap that no amount of international validation can bridge domestically. The NEF's 4 demands are individually grounded in documented institutional sources, constitutional provisions, formal communiqués, and dated open letters. The question of whether those demands represent the authentic sentiment of the northern population broadly or the interests of a specific elite grouping cannot be resolved by Afronews HQ and is not the job of political analysis to adjudicate. What political analysis can do is note that the Tinubu administration has not publicly answered any of the 4 demands on the merits, and that unanswered institutional arguments in a pre-election environment tend to become electoral arguments. The concerned northern elders' counter-narrative is real and represents a meaningful segment of northern elite opinion, specifically those who have proximity to or expectation of benefit from the current administration. But the volume, consistency, and escalating tone of the NEF statement over 2.5 years suggests that the accommodationist camp is a minority position within northern civil society leadership, even if it is well represented among those with ministerial access. The distinction matters for 2027 because electoral outcomes are determined by voters, not by ministerial appointees.
What Nigeria needs from this moment? A federal government that answers constitutional arguments on the merits rather than through counter-narrative management. A security architecture that treats the protection of northern lives as its primary metric rather than an operational update. A census process credible enough to survive rejection by the regions that feel excluded from administering it. And a borrowing program whose accountability framework is robust enough to withstand a formal audit against its own stated capital project outcomes. Nigeria's democratic health going into its 27th year of uninterrupted civilian rule depends not just on who wins in 2027, but on whether the institutions governing the election and the government formed after it are strong enough to answer the documented demands of the populations they are constituted to serve. We began with a paper trail. A security state of emergency demand that has not been answered. An appointment argument grounded in Section 14, Sub 3 that has not been rebutted. A gold refinery protest that has been dismissed with a private sector disclaimer. A borrowing opposition that cites a 2025 capital delivery rate the government has not publicly contested. Each of those documents tells a piece of the same story. A forum that has used every institutional channel available to it. An administration that has responded with counter-narrative management rather than policy response. And a 2027 election approaching in which the gap between what was documented and what was delivered will become the central argument of every candidate who wants northern support. What the northern elders actually want from Tinubu is not complicated. It is in writing. It has been submitted through formal institutional channels. It is grounded in specific constitutional provisions and documented economic data. The question is not whether the demands are legitimate. The paper trail establishes that they are. The question is whether an administration that has not answered them in 2.5 years will answer them in the 12 months before Nigeria votes, and if it does not, whether the political cost of that non-answer will be extracted in the election, or whether northern political frustration will once again be managed rather than addressed, producing a result that neither resolves the grievance nor holds the government accountable for it. Nigeria has been in that loop before. The democratic question for 2027 is whether it is capable of breaking it. You now know something that most Nigerians watching the news tonight do not know. What you do with that is up to you. Share it, debate it, challenge it. That is how democracies survive. Afro News HQ.
Nigeria deserves better analysis. See you in the next one.